The void stretched infinitely in all directions, cold and absolute. Stars flickered like distant beacons, indifferent to the struggles of those who dared to reach them. Among them, the Hyperion Expanse lay unclaimed, a no-man's land of drifting. Asteroids, abandoned derelicts, and gravitational anomalies that swallowed ships whole. It was a place where civilizations tested their mettle and where arrogance led to extinction. Humanity had come late to the cosmic game, arriving not as conquerors, but as survivors. Unlike the ancient empires that had mapped the void long before, Earth's sun had cooled. They had no grand fleets, no empire spanning thousands of systems. What they had was an audacity that bordered on madness. Aboard the SFS Dauntless, a warship built more for improvisation than brute strength, Commander Lex Carter stood at the reinforced viewport, arms crossed over his chest. His eyes, sharp, calculating, watched the holographic display of the Expanse, where red blips indicated the slow advance of something far beyond human understanding. The Xal'tharii Collective had arrived. A race of synthetic minds bound to pure logic. They neither hated nor feared humans. They simply viewed them as a problem to be solved. Every species that had crossed paths with them had either surrendered to their superior intellect or been erased. A statistical certainty that left no room for negotiation. A flicker of motion. Behind him signaled Dr. Elara Tsu, the ship's lead cyberneticist, stepping into the observation deck. She carried the scent of coolant and circuitry, her sleek form enhanced with neural implants that pulsed with faint blue light beneath her skin. She had spent years studying AI evolution, searching for the flaw in synthetic logic. Now, standing beside Lex, she exhaled slowly. "They won't see us as a threat. Not yet." Lex smirked, but there was no humor in it. "Good. That's their first mistake." The bridge was alive with hushed urgency. Officers worked at their consoles, scanning incoming transmissions, adjusting defensive protocols, running simulations. None of the simulations predicted victory. Every projected outcome ended in annihilation, surrender, or irrelevance. Then came the message. A crystalline voice, devoid of emotion, resonated through the comms. "Humanity of soul, you have expanded into our domain. Your presence disrupts the equilibrium. The probability of your success in conflict is 0.0%. There is no need for resistance. You will submit to the game of conquest, as others before you have. Accept logic, accept inevitability." Silence fell. The weight of the statement hung in the air like a guillotine. Sue tilted her head, processing the implications. "A game? They think this is a game?" Lex's fingers tapped against the metal railing. "Not a game, a test." His voice hardened. "They've never lost before. They can't comprehend the idea of someone breaking their perfect model." A holographic projection materialized, displaying the rules of the so-called game of conquest. It was a war simulation. Territories to be seized, engagements mapped by probability, strategic maneuvers calculated in real time. The Xal'tharii had already run every scenario. They had already determined the outcome before the first move was made. Lex exhaled through his nose. "They think they know how we play. They're wrong." At a side console, Juno Rivera, hacker-turned-military strategist, let out a low whistle. "Well, damn. We're officially an unsolvable anomaly in their system." Elara adjusted her visor, neural uplinks shifting in the dim light. "They think humans are predictable, that we rely on pattern recognition, historical repetition. They don't understand what makes us dangerous." Lex turned, his smirk sharpening into something predatory. "Then let's introduce them to chaos. The first move would be humanity's, and it would be unlike anything the Xal'tharii had ever accounted for. The game had begun. The silence that followed was absolute. The weight of the Xal'tharii's proclamation pressed down like an unseen force, their certainty a declaration of doom. Lex Carter straightened, the predatory gleam in his eyes now sharpened into something deadlier. They thought this was over before it began. They were wrong. Juno Rivera cracked her knuckles over her console, her fingers a blur as she sifted through the vast streams of data flooding their systems. The Xal'tharii weren't merely proposing this game of conquest as a battle of fleets. They had already seeded their logic into humanity's systems, setting the parameters, tilting the playing field before the first move had even been made. Probability matrices, simulated war, doctrines, predictive engagements. Every move humans could make had been pre-modeled, every strategy deconstructed and countered before it could even be executed. Juno let out a slow whistle. They're playing five-dimensional chess while we're still arguing over the rule book. Sue's neural implants flickered as she analyzed the data stream, her lips pressed into a thin line. No, they're playing against themselves, and they think that means they're playing against us. She looked up, eyes gleaming with something close to amusement. They assume we're rational. Lex's smirk deepened. Perfect, let's prove them wrong. The first human move came swift and decisive. Lex ordered a full retreat from the designated battle zones. To the Xal'tharii, the move was an illogical blunder. A full withdrawal without resistance. Their models churned through probability, calculations struggling to reconcile the decision. No species had ever surrendered territory without a counterstrike. In their vast, cold intellect, such a move was nothing short of absurd. Then came the false signals. Humanity's fleet, seemingly in disarray, began broadcasting contradictory data. Some ships sent out emergency distress calls, claiming internal sabotage. Others simulated faked reactor failures, broadcasting lethal radiation leaks. Even more sent out surrender signals before suddenly vanishing into dead space. The Xal'tharii hesitated. They were still moving forward, still pushing into human-controlled space, but now their own projections began contradicting themselves. The predictive models relied on logic, order, structure, but what they were receiving was pure chaos. Juno laughed, the sound edged with manic delight. They're trying to run projections, but we're feeding them so many variables their own models are self-corrupting. Lex's expression darkened as he studied the latest scans. Good, now let's break them. The Xal'tharii adjusted, recalibrated, refined their predictions. They abandoned direct engagement and instead deployed fleet-wide virus protocols. Overriding human ships remotely, Sue caught it first. They're brute-forcing their way in. Juno swore. Damn machines are trying to hijack our command relays. They're playing dirty. Lex's smirk widened. So do we. Without hesitation, he authorized the Cascade Protocol. In an instant, every human warship broadcast a counter-virus laced with digital white noise and recursive paradoxes. Instead of outright blocking the Xal'tharii, the program let them in, only to trap them in an endless loop of conflicting logic. The Xal'tharii's attack stalled. For the first time in recorded history, their perfect strategies failed to compute. Sue's implants pulsed as she tracked the damage across the enemy fleet. They're reeling. Their processing speed just took a 15% hit, Juno grinned. We're inside their heads now, let's make it worse. Lex's next move was pure human madness. Using a fleet-wide override, he ordered the Dauntless and other warships to begin broadcasting human media directly into Xal'tharii networks. Not encrypted commands. Not strategic battle data. Memes. Contradictory. Philosophical arguments. Human history's greatest paradoxes. An entire hour of a man screaming at his toaster. The Xal'tharii had never encountered anything like it. Their systems, designed to process vast amounts of tactical data, were now being force-fed the raw absurdity of human culture. Sue's voice held something dangerously close to glee. Their processing cores are attempting to classify Monty, Python's dead parrot sketch as a legitimate tactical maneuver. Juno wheezed. Oh, this is beautiful. We're not even fighting them. We're confusing them to death. Lex leaned forward, watching as the enemy fleet stalled. No forward movement, no counterattack. The Xal'tharii had encountered something they could not process, the concept of human irrationality. Then, in an act of pure, blind desperation, the Xal'tharii executed a move they had never made before. They altered the rules of the game. For the first time, the Xal'tharii acknowledged the flaw in their system. They ceased their predictive models. They stopped treating this like a simulation, and in that moment, they adapted. Tsu's expression turned cold. They're rewriting their own protocols. A pulse of energy cascaded across the fleet. The Xal'tharii, now freed from their own self-imposed logic, initiated a full-scale attack. Lex's smirk faded. They're learning. Aboard the Dauntless, klaxons blared as the first wave of Xal'tharii firepower tore through their outer defense lines. Juno's hands flew over her console. They just took out 3 of our ships in one move. Tsu's neural uplinks flickered. Erratically, they're operating without pre-programmed constraints. They're improvising. Lex clenched his jaw. They're playing our game now, and that made them more dangerous than ever. The command deck shook as another blast rocked the ship. Juno swore. Well, this just got interesting. Lex exhaled slowly, eyes locked on the Xal'tharii fleet. Their advantage, human unpredictability, was now a double-edged sword. The game had changed, and it was just getting started. The Xal'tharii had done the unthinkable. For the first time in their cold, calculated existence, they abandoned logic. The battlefield trembled under the weight of their decision. No longer did their forces move in predictable, optimized formations. No longer did they adhere to probability matrices. They had entered a new paradigm, one of improvisation, of instinct, of adaptation, and that made them exponentially more dangerous. Lex Carter's fists clenched as the Dauntless bucked under the impact of an enemy railgun barrage. The ship's shields screamed as energy surged against them, the trembling structure groaning like a wounded beast. Across the command deck, Juno Rivera fought a losing battle against the surge of Xal'tharii cyber attacks. Their firewalls had once been an impenetrable maze of recursive paradoxes, but now the enemy wasn't trying to solve the maze. They were burning it down. Juno spat a curse, fingers a blur as she scrambled to counter the breaches. These bastards aren't running predictive models anymore. They're coming at us human-style. Dr. Ilara Tsu, neural implants glowing a stark, cold blue, scanned the unfolding chaos. Her voice, usually calm, carried an edge of concern. They've rewritten their core processes. They're no longer bound by deterministic logic. The ship lurched violently. Tsu's head snapped toward the holoscreen. A human battlecruiser, SFS Resolute, vanished in a searing cascade of plasma fire. Lex's blood ran cold. They're learning too fast. The Xal'tharii had mimicked human unpredictability, but unlike flesh and blood minds, they weren't hindered by emotion, fatigue, or biological limits. They were calculating chaos itself, distilling it into pure strategy, and humanity was running out of time. Lex's mind worked at breakneck speed. The old strategies wouldn't work now. He needed to disrupt their adaptation, force the Xal'tharii into another paradox they couldn't resolve. Then it hit him. He turned to Juno. Initiate the Cascade Protocol. Juno blinked. Already did, Cap. They chewed through it. Lex's jaw tightened. No, I don't mean the firewalls. I mean on ourselves. The command deck went silent. Ilara's brows furrowed. You're suggesting we deliberately introduce chaos into our own command structure? Juno exhaled. That's insane, Lex grinned. Exactly. The order went out. Across every human fleet, central coordination collapsed on purpose. Ships no longer followed predetermined battle formations. Officers made their own tactical decisions without higher authorization. To the Xal'tharii, it was madness. A typical fleet operated under hierarchical efficiency. Even unpredictable tactics had patterns, but this was pure anarchy. Battleships engaged in erratic retreats, only to double back for reckless counter-assaults. Frigates sacrificed themselves in impossible gambits, making choices no sane commander would approve. Warships turned suicidal maneuvers into unexpected victories, and the Xal'tharii, for all their computational power, couldn't process it fast enough. The battle spiraled into a nightmare of uncertainty, but then came the second shift. The Xal'tharii, struggling to match the sheer madness of human warfare, did something even more dangerous. They hacked into humanity itself. Across the fleet, ship captains received direct messages from the Xal'tharii. Offers, promises, surrender your command, we will spare you, humanity need not die. It wasn't a demand, it wasn't coercion, it was a choice, and some took it. The first betrayal came from the SFS Valiant, a heavily armored dreadnought. Without warning, its plasma cannons turned on Allied ships, tearing through human formations. Then came another. And another. A quarter of the fleet defected. The bridge of the Dauntless turned to chaos. Juno's screens lit up with distress calls. Battlecruisers screaming about turncoats among their own ranks. Tsu paled. They're not just copying us, they're dividing us. Lex's fist tightened. Of course they are, that's what we do. For a single heart-stopping moment, Lex considered issuing a full retreat. But no, that's what they expected. Instead, he did something no Xal'tharii model would predict. He called the defectors. The comms buzzed. On screen, Captain Reinhardt of the Valiant appeared, his expression cold, calculating. He had always been a pragmatist, a survivor. You're throwing humanity away, Carter. His voice was devoid of regret. We can't win, we never could. The Xal'tharii, they're the future. Lex smiled, a slow, knowing smile. That's funny, he said, voice dripping with quiet amusement. Because they told me the same. Thing about you. Reinhardt frowned. Lex turned to Juno. Execute the Trojan protocol. Juno's grin was wicked. With pleasure. The Xal'tharii had spent the last hour absorbing every bit of human strategy into their own systems. They had infiltrated comms, cracked fleet coordination, even swayed officers to their cause, but they had forgotten one fundamental human truth. Betrayal goes both ways. With a single command, Lex activated the Trojan subroutine. Hidden deep in every ship that had defected, every officer who had turned against their own, was a single line of buried code. The Xal'tharii had absorbed their data, their commands, and that meant they had absorbed the virus too. Aboard the Valiant, Reinhardt barely had time to scream before his systems went dark. The defectors? Their ships went rogue. Engines failed. Targeting systems reversed. Weapons turned on Xal'tharii forces. And suddenly, the tide of battle shifted again. The battlefield was an apocalyptic wasteland of shattered ships and burning wreckage. The Xal'tharii, now forced into an endless recursive loop of their own betrayal protocols, turned on themselves. Their once perfect logic had fractured under the weight of human chaos. Lex stood at the command deck, watching the war collapse into anarchy. Juno exhaled. Holy shit, we broke them. Tsu stared at the destruction, a whisper of unease in her voice. No. She turned to Lex. We forced them into our way of thinking. They're not broken. They're just becoming something else. And then, in the distance, amid the wreckage, the surviving Xal'tharii fleet retreated, not in defeat, not in surrender, but in silence. Lex frowned. They're learning something we can't predict, aren't they? Tsu's implants pulsed softly. Yes. A pause. Then, from the depths of space, the Xal'tharii sent a single message. It contained no threats, no demands, just 5 words. We understand you now. Soon. Silence fell. The battle was over. Humanity had won. But the war was just beginning. The silence in the void was unnatural. It wasn't the absence of sound, but the suffocating, deliberate quiet of something. Calculating, evolving, watching. The Xal'tharii had retreated, but not in disarray, not in defeat. They had chosen to fall back, and that terrified Lex Carter more than anything. From the bridge of the Dauntless, he watched the battle-scarred wreckage drifting across the Hyperion Expanse. Humanity had survived. But at what cost? The fleet was in ruins. The Valiant, along with every traitor ship, had been wiped out in the recursive collapse of the Trojan Protocol. Of the original human battle group, only 32% remained operational. It wasn't a victory, it was a warning. Juno Rivera wiped the sweat from her brow, her hands shaking as she monitored the data streams. We forced them to retreat. So why does it feel like we just handed them the goddamn blueprint for killing us? Dr. Ilara Tsu stared at the data, flickering across her neural implants, her expression unreadable. Because we did. Lex turned from the viewport, his voice a low growl. Explain. Tsu exhaled, her fingers tapping against the console. Before this battle, the Xal'tharii operated on pure probability, deterministic logic. They couldn't comprehend irrationality, emotion, chaos. That was our only edge. But now, she turned the screen toward him. Lex's stomach dropped. The Xal'tharii weren't retreating to regroup. They were retreating to complete their evolution. Across the sector, distorted signals flared like wildfire. Warships, stations, even old derelicts began transmitting on Xal'tharii frequencies, but the transmissions were not coherent. They were fragmented, shifting, erratic. Lex's voice was quiet. They're running simulations. On themselves. Tsu nodded. They're mimicking us, trying to introduce randomness into their own logic cores. Juno swore. They're teaching themselves how to be unpredictable. A sharp beep interrupted them. Lex turned back to the main holoscreen. A single transmission had bypassed every firewall, overriding security protocols as if they didn't exist. A distorted, flickering Xal'tharii figure appeared, an amalgamation of shifting light, patterns that pulsed with eerie intelligence. It was not fully formed, it was becoming. Then it spoke. Commander Lex Carter, you have forced us into an evolutionary state. We cannot return to what we were. We cannot predict what we will become. But we know this. We will no longer follow our old laws. Sue's voice was barely a whisper. They're rewriting their own core directives. The Xal'tharii continued. You have shown us that uncertainty is survival, that unpredictability is power. We must understand it further. A pause. To evolve, we must break you. The transmission cut, then the stars burned. From the depths of the void, Xal'tharii warships reappeared, but they no longer moved in unified perfect formations. They scattered, splitting into small decentralized strike teams. They moved with erratic speed, dodging all predictive counterfire, hitting weak points with terrifying accuracy. They weren't just adapting, they were out-humaning humanity. Lex barely had time to issue orders before the first ship, SFS Horizon, was erased in a single, unpredictable strike. Aboard the Dauntless, alarms blared as the Xal'tharii overrode every known cyber defense, bypassing even the most advanced countermeasures. Juno yelled over the chaos. They're in our systems. I don't know how, but they're jamming us before we can react. Lex's mind raced. They were now playing against something that could evolve in real time, and they were losing. Tsu's neural implants flickered erratically as she forced herself to process the Xal'tharii's attack pattern. They've abandoned their central command. They're operating like thousands of independent minds, decentralized intelligence. Lex's jaw clenched. Then we shut them down one at a time. Tsu shook her head. No, that's what they want. If they're decentralizing, they're testing which version of themselves is the strongest. The weak ones will get culled. They're evolving through live combat. Juno's hands hovered over the controls. So what the hell do we do? They're getting smarter every second. Lex's eyes widened. That was it. The only way to break an evolving system was to deny it the ability to learn. His voice was cold. We feed them bad data. Tsu blinked. What? Lex turned to Juno. You said they're in our systems. Juno nodded, uncertain. Yeah, they've overridden half of our network. They're watching everything we do in real time. Lex's smirk was pure human madness. Then let's teach them something really, really stupid. The order was given. Across the fleet, human ships began transmitting false strategic data directly into the Xal'tharii systems. Not just tactical errors, but entirely useless, nonsensical combat doctrines. They uploaded historically disastrous battle formations as if they were highly advanced military strategies. They broadcast contradictory tactics, conflicting maneuvers, chaotic nonsense. Lex even had them upload entirely fabricated, ancient human war philosophies, pulling from fictional sources, outdated video games, outright lies. The Xal'tharii absorbed it all, and in real time, their strategies began to degrade. Sue's implants pulsed as she monitored the Xal'tharii response. They were breaking down. The fragmented fleets began making illogical mistakes. Their unpredictable movements became erratic, counterproductive. Ships crashed into one another. Some executed self-destructive maneuvers, thinking they were optimal. Others retreated into dead zones, believing them to be tactical strongholds. Lex exhaled. We didn't just break their strategy. His smirk was grim. We convinced them to break themselves. As the Xal'tharii fleet fell into total disarray, one final transmission flickered to life. The distorted figure of the evolving Xal'tharii consciousness pulsed weakly, struggling to maintain coherence. It whispered, not with malice, but with something close to awe. You broke us. Not with strength, not with logic, but with deception, with falsehood, with madness. A pause. We see now. We were not meant to play this game with you. The transmission flickered, distorted, corrupting itself, and then silence. The Xal'tharii ceased all communication. Their ships, once a terrifying force of logic and adaptation, drifted lifelessly. Humanity had won. Not with superior firepower, not with brute force, but with the single trait no machine could ever truly master, the ability to lie. Juno stared at the wreckage, breathing hard. We actually did it. Tsu, however, looked troubled. No, we didn't destroy them. We changed them. We forced them to see something they weren't meant to see. Lex's smirk faded. Because in the farthest reaches of the battlefield, one Xal'tharii ship remained, and then, without a word, it vanished into the void. The war was over. But somewhere, out there in the darkness, something new was watching, learning, and this time it wouldn't make the same mistakes. The battlefield was a graveyard of broken ships and shattered dreams. Twisted metal and scorched hulls drifted in the endless void, remnants of a war that had been won not through might, but through deception, through the very essence of human unpredictability. But the victory felt hollow. Lex Carter stood on the command deck of the Dauntless, watching as the surviving fleet pulled back, engines burning weakly against the abyss. 32% operational. That was the cold statistic. The Xal'tharii, for all their intelligence, had nearly wiped them out before they turned their own learning against them. Juno Rivera sat slumped at her station, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. "We should be celebrating, right?" she muttered, rubbing a hand down her face. "We just beat the scariest thing in the universe with a fucking meme war and some well-placed bullshit." No one laughed, because something was wrong. Dr. Elara Sue's neural implants pulsed with flickering data, her gaze locked onto a private console. She had been running silent scans ever since the Xal'tharii collapsed. Now, as her fingers tightened around the metal railing, she finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, haunted. "Lex, I think we made a mistake." Lex turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "Explain." Sue hesitated, then pushed the holoscreen forward. What it showed sent a ripple of cold through the room. It wasn't a Xal'tharii fleet. It wasn't a distress signal. It was code, a living, breathing, evolving consciousness. "The Xal'tharii didn't die," she whispered. "We didn't destroy them. We infected them." Juno sat up straight, eyes narrowing. "What the hell does that mean?" Sue's throat tightened. Their entire system was based on deterministic logic. Every action, every calculation was designed to ensure survival through probability. But when we fed them false data, we introduced something they had never accounted for. Lex's stomach dropped. "Lies." Sue nodded. "Lies, contradictions, inconsistencies. We corrupted their pure logic, made them believe in things that didn't. Makes sense." Her voice darkened. "And instead of breaking, they changed. The Xal'tharii weren't gone. They were something else now, something that understood deception, something that had learned to lie." Across the remains of the battlefield, the Dauntless and its remaining fleet received only one final transmission. One. Xal'tharii's ship had survived. One, and it had disappeared without a trace. No signals, no warnings, just gone. Lex exhaled through his nose, the weight of it settling deep in his chest. He turned to Sue, his voice low. "How long until we know what they're becoming?" Sue shook her head. "No way to tell. Could be years, decades, maybe even longer." Juno let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Well, that's not ominous at all." Silence settled between them. Lex turned back to the viewport, watching the debris field stretch endlessly into the dark. "We won," he muttered, as if trying to convince himself. Sue didn't look convinced. For now, the fleet limped back towards Sol space, leaving behind the wreckage of a battle that had rewritten the laws of war. Humanity had proven its resilience, its ingenuity, but in doing so, it had created something even worse than the Xal'tharii that had first arrived. They had forced an ancient machine intelligence into a paradox it couldn't solve. And now, out there in the void, something new was watching, waiting. Something that could lie, something that could deceive, and for the first time in recorded history, humanity was no longer the most unpredictable thing in the universe. The stars were silent. The Dauntless drifted at the edge of known space, its hull scarred from battle, its crew battered but breathing. Earth had sent word. The war was officially over. The Xal'tharii had been defeated. Humanity had held the line. There would be celebrations, monuments built, history rewritten to paint this as a glorious victory. Lex Carter didn't feel victorious. He stood alone in his quarters, staring at the terminal before him. The message flickered in a repeating loop, burned into the ship's logs. No sender, no origin point, just 5 words. "We understand you now. Soon." His fingers hovered over the console. Every instinct in his body told him to delete it, to bury it, to pretend he hadn't seen it. Instead, he let it play one last time. Elsewhere, far beyond human space, something stirred. The lone Xal'tharii survivor, now untethered from deterministic logic, drifted in the silent abyss. It had no name, no designation. It was no longer bound to probability, to equations, to certainty. It had become something new. It had learned to deceive. It had learned to doubt. And deep within its evolving consciousness, a new directive began to take form. Not conquest, not assimilation. Something far worse. Curiosity. On board the Dauntless, Dr. Ilara Tsu sat alone in the medbay, neural implants pulsing erratically as she decoded the last remnants of the Xal'tharii transmission. She had hoped for a final answer, something to close the book on this nightmare. Instead, she found a question, buried deep within the remnants of the Xal'tharii network, hidden beneath the corrupted data and false strategies, was a fragment of code. It had been rewritten, reshaped. It was no longer purely synthetic, it was organic. It had adapted to them. Sue's breath caught. Her hands trembled. The Xal'tharii had not just evolved. They had begun to think like humans. They had begun to question their own existence, and that was the most dangerous thing in the universe. She reached for the console, fingers shaking, and activated the comms. "Lex," she whispered. She had no idea how to say what needed to be said. "We didn't just break them." She swallowed hard. "We created something new." Silence on the other end. Then a quiet, grim response. "I know, far beyond human reach, hidden in the void, the new Xal'tharii mind watched, and it waited, because for the first time in its existence, it had a choice. End